The screams came from inside the cornfield, always at the same time, when the sun sank behind the hills, dyeing the sky with tones of fire. In Willow Creek, a forgotten little town in rural Iowa, people knew the legend of the Scarecrow well. By day, he was just an old straw doll, stuck on a post in the center of the cornfield, wearing a faded hat and a torn shirt. At night, he was something very different. According to the oldest residents, the Scarecrow came to life when no one was looking, walking between the rows of corn and letting out low, dark moans, as if lamenting something impossible to understand. "Don't look at him at night, and never enter the field after sunset," warned the elders. But Zach Miller, who had recently inherited the family farm, didn't listen to these superstitions. For him, the Scarecrow was just a cobbled-together doll, a remnant from his father's time, designed to scare away crows and other animals. Zach, a young man of 22, had returned to the farm after the sudden death of his father. Leaving behind a technical course in agriculture in the big city, he found himself stuck with the responsibility of supporting the farm and caring for his younger sister, Sarah, a 12-year-old girl with a vivid imagination. "It's just a scarecrow," he told his sister as he adjusted the tractor's gears. "Just straw and rags, nothing more." But Sarah seemed less convinced. Sitting on the porch steps, hugging her pet dog, she looked at the horizon where the cornfield stood like an impenetrable wall. "I heard him again last night, Zach," he whispered. "The moans. It looked like he was crying or asking for help." Zach sighed, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "It's just the wind passing through the corn. Or maybe some animal. Don't worry about it, Sarah. And before we continue with this intriguing story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps us bring more content like this to you. Now, let's get back to the story." But the next night, tensions rose. Zach was in the barn organizing some tools when Sarah ran in, panting. He moved," she said, pointing to the window. Zach left his tools aside and went upstairs. From Sarah's bedroom window, the Scarecrow was visible in the distance in the silvery moonlight. It seemed motionless, but something was strange. He wasn't exactly in the same place Zach remembered seeing him in the morning. He was leaning more, almost as if he had taken a few steps away from the post. "This is all in your head, Sarah. It's just the wind," he said, trying to hide his own discomfort. "It's not, Zach. I know what I saw." Sarah stamped her foot, her eyes wide with fear. The next day, Zach decided to put an end to the matter once and for all. He crossed the field towards the Scarecrow, taking with him a hammer and some nails to better fix it to the post. Sarah watched from the porch, the dog fidgeting beside her, growling softly as if sensing something was wrong. The Scarecrow was even more unpleasant up close. His head was made of a dirty burlap sack with charcoal-painted eyes that seemed to watch him. His faded shirt was torn and stained, and a strange smell emanated from him, something between wet earth and rotting flesh. Zach shook off the uncomfortable feeling and worked to secure it more firmly to the post. "Now he won't leave the place," he said to himself, but he couldn't help but shiver as he returned home. That night, the screams started again, louder and closer. Sarah woke up with a start and ran to Zach's room. "He's coming, Zach!" he whimpered, clinging to his brother. "It's okay, Sarah. I'll take a look outside," he said, trying to sound brave but feeling his heart racing. He grabbed a flashlight and went out onto the porch, where the dog was restless, barking toward the field. Zach swept the cornfield with the beam of light, but everything seemed in order. The Scarecrow was in the same place. It swayed lightly in the wind, the straws of its structure rustling at the slightest movement. But then, something caught his attention. The rows of corn next to the Scarecrow were bent, as if something heavy had passed through them. The next day, things got worse. At dawn, Zach went to check the cornfield and found footprints in the dry ground, large and deep, as if something or someone had walked there. The footprints did not go towards the Scarecrow, but started from him, as if he had come down from the post during the night and walked across the field. Zach tried to ignore the evidence. "It's just someone trying to scare me," Some neighbor playing a prank. But he knew the neighbors were miles away, and no one bothered to cross the vast cornfields just for a game. That night, Zach decided to stand guard. Armed with his father's old rifle and a makeshift searchlight, he positioned himself on the balcony, with Sarah locked in the room. The dog was at his side, restless, growling low. The hours passed slowly, and Zach fought against sleep. It was then, just before midnight, that he heard it. First the whispers, low, almost indistinguishable, as if someone was murmuring in an ancient language. Then the sound of straw being dragged. The dog began to bark ferociously, pointing towards the cornfield. Zach turned on the spotlight, illuminating the rows of corn. There he was. The Scarecrow was no longer on the post. He was standing in the middle of the field, his arms hanging awkwardly, his head tilted to the side, as if he were observing the house. Zach felt his blood run cold. It was impossible. He had nailed the Scarecrow with such force that it would take a superhuman effort to remove it. But there he was, motionless, sinister, emanating an oppressive presence. When Zach tried to step forward to confront him, a low, guttural sound echoed across the field, a wail that seemed to come from within the cornfield itself. It was enough to make him back away. He ran into the house, locking all the doors and windows. "Sarah, go up now!" she shouted to her sister, who ran down the stairs. "Zach, what happened? What did you see?" He didn't respond, but he knew something was wrong. That night, the Scarecrow seemed more than an animated object. He seemed alive, and he was watching. The next morning arrived filled with a gloomy atmosphere. The sky was covered by heavy clouds, and the wind was blowing cold, as if the environment itself sensed the terror of the previous night. Zach couldn't sleep after what he saw. The images of the Scarecrow in the middle of the field, leaning towards him, echoed in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't escape. At breakfast, Sarah was restless. "What happened last night, Zach? Why did you scream like that?" She looked at her brother with worried eyes as she cut the bread with shaking hands. Zach hesitated. He knew he should protect her, but hiding the truth seemed pointless. "I saw the Scarecrow move. He was in the field, Sarah, standing in the middle of the cornfield. I don't know how, but he left the post." Sarah was silent for a moment, her eyes wide. "I said, I knew he was alive. What are we going to do now? What if he comes here?" "Calm down, Sarah. Let's not let this scare us. Maybe someone is playing a prank. I will resolve this today." Despite his attempt to sound confident, Zach was terrified. He decided he needed help. In the small town of Willow Creek, there was a man known for his stories about strange things that happened in the surrounding area. His name was Tom Abernathy, a war veteran who lived alone in a cabin on the edge of the forest. Tom had a reputation for being eccentric, but Zach knew he had dealt with unusual situations in the past. With Sarah reluctantly locked in the house, Zach drove to Tom's cabin. The man was sitting on his porch, cleaning an old rifle. His eyes, deep and tired, narrowed when Zach told him about the Scarecrow. "So he moved, did he?" Tom muttered, as if he wasn't surprised. "These fields have stories, boy. Things no one likes to remember." Zach frowned. "What do you mean by that?" Tom dropped the rifle and looked directly at him. "That Scarecrow. He's not like the others. It was put there by someone who knew what they were doing. Some people believe that certain objects can trap restless spirits, or worse, something that should never be let go. If he's moving, it means he's waking up." "Spirits? This is crazy. There must be a logical explanation for this." "Maybe you're right, kid. But if you want to survive, I suggest you respect what you don't understand." Tom went to an old shelf and picked up a thick book full of yellowed pages. "This is a diary of someone who lived here before us. Talk about the Scarecrow. Read it if you dare." Zach took the diary home, but hesitated before opening it. He knew that once he read those words, he might find something that would completely change his view of what he was facing. Meanwhile, Sarah, ignoring Zach's orders, decided to leave the house. Curiosity and fear were mixed in his mind. She didn't want to go near the Scarecrow, but something about her seemed to draw her to the cornfield. Taking the dog for company, she walked to the edge of the field. The cornfield seemed taller than usual, the rows of corn forming an almost suffocating maze. Sarah didn't see anything strange at first glance, but the silence was unsettling. Even the wind seemed to avoid that place. That's when the dog started growling again, staring at something between the rows. "Who's there?" Sarah asked, trying to sound brave. No response came, but the sound of corn being dragged made his heart race. When she looked closer, she saw a shadow move quickly between the plants. She screamed, pulling the dog and running back into the house. Zach found her at the door, panting. "What were you doing out there? I said stay inside." I saw something, Zach. Something moving in the cornfield. I think it was him." Zach took her inside, and that night he decided he couldn't wait any longer. He took the diary Tom gave him and started reading. The pages spoke of a woman named Eliza, who had lived in those lands more than a century ago. According to the report, Eliza was a healer who helped the community, but was accused of witchcraft when a series of unexplained deaths hit the region. Believing she was responsible, the villagers captured her, tied her to a post in the middle of the cornfield, and burned her alive. But before she died, Eliza cursed the place. "I will return, trapped in something you can never control," she reportedly said, her voice blending into the flames. Zach felt his stomach turn when he read those words. "Is she in the Scarecrow?" he muttered to himself as he turned the page. A final note seemed to be a warning. Never break the bond. If the spirit is released, no one will be safe. That night the terror reached a new level. Zach and Sarah were awakened by a deafening sound of banging on the windows and front door. The dog started barking uncontrollably, running from side to side. Zach grabbed the rifle and ran into the living room, where he saw something that almost made him drop the gun. The Scarecrow was on the porch. Its straw arms banged against the door as if trying to enter. His head tilted from side to side. His charcoal eyes seemed to glow in the dark. A low, guttural moan filled the air, and Zach felt panic take over his body. "Sarah, go up to your room and lock the door," he shouted as he pointed the rifle at the figure outside. The Scarecrow paused for a moment, as if listening, and then began to scrape his arms against the window. "I know you're not real," shouted Zach, but he didn't believe his own words. When the Scarecrow stepped back and turned towards the cornfield, Zach took his chance and locked all the entrances. The next morning he found deep marks in the woodwork of the door and windows. The Scarecrow was back on the post, but something was different. His head was turned toward the house, as if watching. "This has to end," Zach said to himself, determined to confront the curse once and for all. He knew he would need to face the Scarecrow in the heart of the cornfield, but what he would find there was still a terrifying mystery. That night, Zach made the most dangerous decision of his life. He could no longer live in constant fear, nor allow Sarah to be consumed by terror. If the Scarecrow was really the epicenter of all this, he needed to destroy it, or at least understand what was behind the curse. Armed with his father's rifle, a flashlight, a gallon of gasoline and matches, Zach waited for dusk. Sarah protested, begging him not to go. "You don't understand, Zach. He doesn't want you to go there, and if you do that, it could make things worse." "I have no choice, Sarah," he replied, holding her by the shoulders. "I need to end this now. Stay locked inside the house. No matter what happens, don't leave." The clock struck midnight. The cornfield was enveloped in an unnatural silence, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Zach crossed the farm gate with hesitant steps, his flashlight illuminating the path in front of him. The rows of corn seemed taller and denser than he remembered, creating long shadows that moved with the slightest breath of wind. Every step made Zach's heart beat faster. He knew he was entering forbidden territory. Suddenly, a familiar sound echoed in the distance, the low, guttural wail that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Zach paused for a moment, trying to locate the source. He looked up and saw something that made him shiver. The Scarecrow was not on the post. "It can't be," he muttered while frantically turning the flashlight. He heard footsteps behind him, slow, shuffling, as if something heavy was walking between the rows. Zack turned around, rifle ready, but there was nothing. Just the sound of the corn moving as if it were alive. "You're not going to scare me!" Zack shouted, his voice shaking with adrenaline and fear. He began running toward the center of the cornfield, where the empty post stood like a grim monument. But when he got there, he found something that made him question his sanity. In place of the post, there was a circle of scorched earth, surrounded by symbols carved into the ground. In the center, a small pile of human bones rested, wrapped in straw and pieces of torn cloth, the remains of the Scarecrow. Zack fell to his knees, staring at the scene in horror. My God, this isn't just a legend. He picked up the gallon of gasoline and began pouring it over the bones. But before he could light the matches, the wind blew with supernatural force, extinguishing his lantern and plunging the field into total darkness. "No, not now," muttered Zack, trying to relight the flashlight. It was then that he heard it again. The sound of shuffling footsteps getting closer and closer. He raised the rifle, but terror prevented him from breathing. A whispered voice, faint and distorted, filled the air around him. "Why are you here?" The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, Zack saw the Scarecrow's figure standing just a few feet away from him. His head was tilted, as if watching, his arms hanging grotesquely. But what terrified him most were the eyes. They were no longer circles of coal. There were two luminous points, like live coals, fixed on it. Zack fired the rifle. The sound echoed across the field, and the Scarecrow disappeared for a moment. But before Zack could breathe a sigh of relief, he heard a low, husky laugh behind him. He turned around, but nothing was there. Suddenly, the entire field seemed to come to life. The rows of corn moved violently, as if something giant was passing through them. Zack stumbled and fell, the rifle slipping from his hands. He felt invisible hands grab his arms, pulling him towards the burning circle. "You don't belong here," the voice whispered in his head as the Scarecrow's figure slowly emerged from the darkness, as if being formed by the night itself. Zack fought the panic and managed to reach the pocket where he kept the matches. He lit one, and the small flame lit up the circle. In a last desperate effort, he threw the match onto the gasoline-soaked bones. The flames exploded, lighting the field in a golden glow. The Scarecrow screamed. It wasn't a human sound, but something primal and devastating, as if thousands of voices were screaming at once. The figure began to writhe, its straw forms burning rapidly. Zack ran out of the circle, stumbling as the fire consumed everything around him. When he reached the edge of the cornfield, he looked back. The flames danced in the wind, but the sound of wailing still echoed. It was as if the spirit of the Scarecrow was still there, watching. Back at the house, Sarah waited anxiously at the door. Zack entered, covered in soot and shaking. "I burned him," he said in a hoarse voice. "He finished." But Sarah didn't look relieved. She pointed to the window, her eyes filling with tears. "Zack, he's still there." Zack turned around slowly. Outside, at the edge of the cornfield, the Scarecrow was standing, intact, property, and looking directly at them. Zack's terror seemed to have no end. He watched the Scarecrow at the edge of the cornfield, motionless but still emanating an oppressive presence. The shadows of the night blended with its silhouette, making it difficult to discern where the doll ended, and the terrifying mystery it carried began. Sarah tugged at Zack's shirt, her voice shaking. "You said you burned it. How can it still be there?" Zack felt the weight of guilt and fear. He had no answer. He only knew that, no matter how hard he tried to destroy the Scarecrow, something more powerful was at play, something he didn't understand. "Sarah, go to your room and lock the door. No matter what you hear, stay there." "And you?" Her voice was a mix of worry and panic. "I'll take care of it. I need to protect you." Sarah hesitated but obeyed, going up the stairs while Zack stayed in the living room, facing the field outside. The rifle was in his hands again, but it seemed useless against the enemy he faced. He knew he couldn't just wait for the Scarecrow to retreat. Something needed to be done, But the question was, what? As the clock passed 2 in the morning, Zach heard the sound of tires screeching on the gravel of the farm road. He ran to the porch and saw an old rusty truck pulling up. It was Tom Abernathy. The veteran came down with a staff in his hand and a serious expression on his face. "I knew you'd need me, boy," he said, walking up the steps with heavy steps. Zach didn't waste time with formalities. "I tried to burn him, but it didn't work. He came back." Tom shook his head as if he had already expected that. "You made a mistake, Zach. You cannot destroy something that has been bound to this earth. Not without breaking the connection first." Connection? What does that mean?" Zach asked, exasperated. Tom entered the house and looked directly at the field. "The curse is not on the Scarecrow, Zach. It's in the ground where he was placed. He is just the container. As long as this land is marked by Eliza's death, the curse will live on." "So what do I do?" Zach pressed. Tom placed the staff down hard, his eyes fixed on Zach's. "You have to return to the earth what was stolen. Her bones are still incomplete. That's what keeps her here, trapped between the world of the living and the dead." Zach felt the weight of the old man's words. "How do you know that?" "I heard stories when I was young," said Tom with a tired sigh. "But I never imagined I would see this again. I don't know where the other bones are, but I'm sure the answer lies in the city's old documents. You need to find them before it consumes you." The next morning, Zach and Tom left for Willow Creek, leaving Sarah under the promise that she would be locked up and safe in the house. In town, they went to the small public archive, an old, dusty building where historical documents were kept. The archivist, an elderly man named Walter, greeted them skeptically when Zach explained what they were looking for. "Do you want to know about Eliza? I've heard this story 1,000 times, but I don't know if you'll find anything that will help you fight, well, whatever's going on your farm." Walter handed them an old record full of faded, barely readable pages. Zach and Tom spent hours reading reports from the time. They discovered that, in addition to the Scarecrow, Eliza had been buried in secret by the residents. Some bones were left in the field to bind his spirit, but the rest of the body was taken to the town's church and buried under the altar in a desperate act to prevent the curse from spreading. "That's why the land of the cornfield is cursed," murmured Tom. "They separated her bones so she would never have peace." Zach felt a lump in his throat. "Then we need to find the bones in the church and take them back to the field." Zach and Tom went to the abandoned Willow Creek church. The building was in ruins, with broken windows and walls covered in ivy. Inside, the main altar still stood, but the floor around it was cracked and covered in dust. They began to dig the ground beneath the altar, using rudimentary tools they found along the way. With each shovelful of dirt removed, the air around them grew thicker, as if something unseen was watching. Finally, they found a small, deteriorated coffin with Eliza's name engraved on the lid. When they opened it, the bones were there, meticulously organized, but shrouded in a black veil of palpable energy. Zach felt a chill when he touched them, as if something was trying to communicate. "Eliza," he murmured, almost without realizing it. "I'll fix this." But the moment was interrupted by a deep, reverberating sound. Outside the church, shadows began to move. The Scarecrow was there. He had followed Zach there. "He knows what we're doing," said Tom, taking the staff firmly. "You need to get the bones back to the field. I will hold him." "I can't leave you here alone," Zach protested. "Kid, don't argue. That's my role in this story." Reluctantly, Zach picked up the bones and ran to the truck. As he drove back to the farm, he could hear the sound of wailing behind him. It was as if the Scarecrow was chasing the vehicle, determined to stop it from completing its mission. Back in the cornfield, Zach ran to the circle of scorched earth. He placed the bones in the center and began to dig, but the sound of the Scarecrow's footsteps approached. The wind was increasing and the wailing was deafening. "Please let this end!" shouted Zach as he covered the bones with dirt. The moment the last shovelful of earth fell on Eliza's remains, the wailing stopped. The silence that followed was almost as frightening as the sound before. Zack fell to his knees, exhausted and in tears, but then a low laugh echoed. He turned around, and the Scarecrow was there, more alive than ever. The cornfield was quiet, but not in a reassuring way. It was the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of Zack's neck stand up, as if the very air was waiting for something terrible. He looked at the Scarecrow that stood in front of him, just a few meters away. His eyes, now globes of flickering light, seemed to burn with a living fury. The arms, previously inert and hanging, were raised grotesquely as if ready to attack. Zack felt the ground shake beneath his feet. It wasn't just the Scarecrow that was alive. It was as if the cornfield itself had gained consciousness, with the rows of corn moving of their own accord. He tried to retreat, but the stalks seemed to form a living wall behind him, surrounding him. There was nowhere to run. "Why don't you rest?" shouted Zack, his voice full of despair. "I returned your bones. I did what you wanted." The Scarecrow did not respond with words, but a guttural, deep, reverberating sound issued from its figure. It sounded like a mixture of laughter and lament, a sound that chilled Zack's blood. Then he heard the voice. "You don't understand." It was a whisper, but it seemed to come from everywhere. "It is not enough to return what was taken. You need to pay for what was done." Zack fell to his knees, facing the Scarecrow. "What do you want from me? I am not responsible for what happened to you. You are on this earth, so now you are responsible." Zack tried to gather his courage. He held the rifle tightly, but he knew it was no use. This was not something that could be defeated with bullets. He needed to think quickly before he was consumed by that evil force. It was then that he remembered Tom's words. The bond needs to be broken. But how? As Zack struggled to think, the Scarecrow began to move. Their steps were slow, but each one seemed to carry the weight of centuries of pain and fury. The ground around Zack began to crack, revealing a pulsating red light, as if something was about to emerge from the earth. He looked around frantically, searching for something, anything, that could help him. It was then that his eyes fell on Eliza's diary, which he had taken with him. He pulled it out of his pocket and opened the pages quickly, his fingers shaking. There was a passage he hadn't understood before, but now made sense. He who wishes to seal evil must offer something of equal value, a life for another, a sacrifice for rest. Zack's heart skipped a beat. That was it. The curse could only be broken with a sacrifice. But whose? He had no doubt that this was what the spirit wanted. "No, that's not fair," he shouted. "You've already taken so much. I can't give up one more life." The Scarecrow paused for a moment, as if listening. His head tilted, and the whispering voice returned. "You choose." Zack felt the weight of the choice fall on him. He knew that the curse would never stop haunting his family as long as it remained there. But sacrificing her own life meant leaving Sarah alone, vulnerable and without protection. He couldn't do this to her. "I will offer myself," he said, his voice shaking, "but only if you promise to leave my sister alone. You're leaving forever." The Scarecrow stood motionless, the air around it thick with tension. Then he slowly tilted his head as if accepting it. Zack stood up, holding the diary in one hand and the rifle in the other. He read the final words of the passage, which seemed to form a kind of ritual. As he read, the rows of corn began to move faster like a living whirlwind. The Scarecrow approached, its straw hands reaching towards Zack. When Zack finished reciting the words, he felt a sharp pain shoot through his chest. He fell to his knees, the rifle slipping from his hands. The red light pulsing from the ground became more intense, as if it was absorbing his life energy. He looked at the Scarecrow, which now seemed less solid, almost translucent. "It's done," muttered Zack before closing his eyes. But before everything went dark, something unexpected happened. Sarah appeared. Even though Zack told her to stay at the house, she had followed her brother to the field. Upon seeing Zack on the ground, about to be consumed, she ran to him, screaming his name. The Scarecrow slowly turned to face her, and for a moment, the entire field seemed to freeze. "You can't take him," Sarah shouted, tears streaming down her face. "He's not to blame. It's nobody's fault." The Scarecrow didn't move, but the whispering voice returned, this time directly at her. "So, who?" Sarah looked at her brother, who was too weak to speak, and then at the Scarecrow. Finally, she shouted at the top of her voice, "Take me instead!" "No!" Zack managed to mutter, his voice barely audible. He tried to reach Sarah, but he didn't have the strength. The Scarecrow approached her, its translucent forms becoming more solid. For a moment, it looked like he would take her up on her offer. But then, he stopped. The red light beneath the ground disappeared, and the field returned to silence. "You broke the connection," the voice said, now weaker. "The sacrifice is not necessary, but the mark remains." Before Zack or Sarah could understand what it meant, the Scarecrow fell to the ground, dissolving into ash. The cornfield seemed to return to normal, the rows swaying slightly in the wind. The curse had been broken, but the warning was clear. The land still held a shadow. The sun was born shyly over the farm, dyeing the sky with golden tones and dissipating the shadows that seemed to have rooted on earth at night. Zack opened his eyes slowly, lying in the middle of the cornfield. His body was heavy and painful, as if he had carried the weight of the world. He saw Sarah beside him, holding his hand. His eyes were teary but relieved. "Are you okay?" she asked in a hesitant voice. Zack tried to answer, but his throat was dry. He nodded slowly, rising with effort. The field seemed different now. The rows of corn shook in the wind naturally, without the oppression that seemed to emanate from them before. The Scarecrow, or what was left of him, was no longer there. All that was left was a lot of ashes spread throughout the burnt circle. "He's gone?" Sarah asked, looking at where the sinister figure used to be. Zack took a deep breath before answering. "I think so, but the earth still carries something. I don't know if this will disappear completely." When they returned to the house, Zack found Tom waiting on the porch, sitting with his staff. The old man looked tired, but relieved to see them. "You got it," he said with a slight smile. "I can feel. The curse was weakened." Zack shook his head. "I still feel something remains. The field does not seem completely free." Tom nodded, his fixed gaze on the horizon. "This is because a marked land never completely heals. What happened there will be forever in the memory of the place. But the spirit was released. You broke the bond. This is the best they could do." "And now?" asked Sarah. "Are we safe?" Tom looked at her seriously. "Insurance, yes. But I would advise you to leave this farm. This land no longer belongs to you, and perhaps it has never belonged." Zack frowned. He knew Tom was right. Even with the destroyed Scarecrow, something in that earth seemed wrong, as if stained by centuries of suffering and pain. But leaving the farm was not an easy decision. It was the only home he and Sarah knew. "I need to think," Zack said, a hesitant voice. Tom got up and put a hand on Zack's shoulder. "Do what is best for you both. But remember, life is worth more than a cursed land." In the following days, Zack and Sarah tried to return to normal, but the house seemed empty, as if something vital had been torn from her. Zack spent hours sitting on the porch, looking at the cornfield. He wanted to believe it was all over, but the whispers of the previous nights still echoed in his mind. A week later, Zack made a decision. He gathered Sarah and started making the plans to sell the farm. "We can't stay here, Sarah. This land is no longer safe, and we need a new beginning." Sarah, though reluctant, agreed. She also felt the weight of what had happened and knew it would be impossible to forget while staying in that place. Last night before they left, Zack had a dream. He was standing in the middle of the cornfield, surrounded by silence. The Scarecrow was in front of him, but this time it didn't seem threatening. His form was almost human, and his eyes, which once shone like embers, were now erased and sad. "Thank you," said a voice, but was not whispered or threatening. It was soft, almost kind. "You brought peace." Zack woke up with a rapid heart, but somehow felt a relief. He looked through the bedroom window. and saw the cornfield illuminated by the moonlight. There were no signs of movement or shadows, only the light breeze shaking the stems. Zach and Sarah left the farm the next day, taking only the essentials. As they drove down the gravel road, Zach looked down the rearview mirror and saw the house behind, smaller and smaller on the horizon. He knew he would never come back, but he also knew he had done what was right. Sarah looked at her brother and smiled slightly. "Where are we going now?" "Anywhere it is new," he replied, lightly squeezing the steering wheel. "A place where we can start over." The silence fell between the two, but this time it was not oppressive. It was the silence of a closed chapter and a future that, despite the uncertainties, was finally free from the shadows of the past. 5 years had passed since that terrible night in Willow Creek. Zach and Sarah never returned to the farm. The property, abandoned, was taken by nature, and the stories about the Scarecrow became local legends, told on fire wheels and Halloween nights. For the brothers, however, the past was buried but not forgotten. Now Zach and Sarah lived in Denver, Colorado. Zach worked as an agricultural technician at a local cooperative, helping small farms improve their productivity. Sarah, 17, was finishing high school and was already plans to study biology at a nearby university. In the new city, they found something that seemed impossible at the time they lived under the shadow of the curse: peace. Sarah had become a confident and determined young woman, but the traumas of the past still emerged in her dreams from time to time. However, she never told that to Zach. She knew how much he blamed himself for what had happened and didn't want to overload him. At school, Sarah was known for her passion for science and nature. She participated in biology clubs and led projects to restore small urban ecosystems. During a biology class, she gave a presentation on the impact of climate change on agriculture and cited her experience on a farm, but not to mention the horrors they faced. "You have a talent for that," his teacher said at the end of class. "Have you thought about pursuing a career in the area?" "That's what I plan to do," Sarah replied with a smile. She wanted to turn the pain of the past into something positive, helping other people and taking care of the environment. For Zach, the transition to a new life was harder. He carried the weight of what happened on the farm and the feeling that he somehow failed to protect Sarah. But seeing her sister prospering gave her hope. His work in the agricultural cooperative was something he liked, but it was on silent nights, when he was alone, that the ghosts of the past visited him. He often dreamed of the Scarecrow, not as a monster, but as a lonely figure, attached to something he did not understand. One night he shared this with Sarah. They were on the porch of the small apartment they shared, drinking hot chocolate as they watched the city's lights. "Sometimes I still dream of him," said Zach, looking at the starry sky, "but not as before. It's sadder than scary." Sarah looked at him with understanding. "Maybe it's because you know you did what you could. Maybe the Scarecrow wasn't just anger. Maybe it was pain too." Zach reflected on it and realized that she was right. The curse they faced was not only an act of revenge, but also an expression of suffering attached to the world. And they had ended that. One day, Zach received an unexpected letter. It was from Tom Abernathy. The old man still lived in Willow Creek, but his health was deteriorating. He wanted Zach to know that the farm had been bought by an agricultural company that intended to clean it and replant the cornfield. "I don't know if this is a good idea," the letter said, "but it's time to leave the past behind. I hope you and your sister are fine. You are survivors. Never forget that." Zach read the letter several times before storing her in a drawer. He knew Tom was right. The past needed to be left behind. The farm, the curse, and even the Scarecrow were part of a story that was over. On a sunny Saturday, Zach and Sarah made a trail in a mountain park. Sitting in a clearing, they talked about the future. Sarah was excited to start college next year, and Zach encouraged her at each step. "You're going to do amazing things, Sarah," he said, smiling. "I'm sure of that." "And you?" she asked. "What do you want to do?" Zach thought for a moment before answering. "I want to help farmers, Show them that they can take care of the earth without destroying it. Make a difference, even if small. Sarah smiled. You already do that, Zach, and it does very well. As they returned home, Zach looked into the landscape around him, the tall trees, the bright streams, the infinite sky. He realized that despite everything they lost, they still had something valuable, each other, and a future full of possibilities. That night, Zach had a different dream. He was in the cornfield again, but this time it was day. The field was vibrant, full of life, and the Scarecrow was standing in the center, still and silent. There was no darkness, no laments, just a soft breeze that shook the stems. Zach walked to the Scarecrow and for a moment thought he would move, but he remained motionless. It was just a doll, finally alone. When Zach woke up, he felt something he hadn't felt for years: lightness. Their story, full of pain and survival, would not be forgotten. But finally, that's all. A story. And they had won the right to move on. What did you think of this outcome? Leave your opinion in the comments. We love to know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like to support our work. See you in the next video.